I appreciate that you've all been good Presbyterians and stayed as far away from the front row as possible this morning. What a story we heard in Scripture, right? It almost sounds like it could be something on Netflix or Hulu or whatever it is you may watch. We've got visions in scene 1 and then another vision in scene 2. And the background for this story makes it even more interesting because during this time, the Roman Empire, so not just like Italy, but the Roman Empire, which encompassed a lot, was very oppressive to the Jews and the Christians. The Roman Empire also took pride in the fact that they had achieved something called Pax Romana. And before you start thinking I'm super smart and can speak some Latin, I just read it. But that means peace, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And what they had done was told people, guess what? You can practice any religion you want to, as long as it's just in your house. You can go ahead. But be sure that you are still praising Caesar, because they believed that their emperors were also a god. And Caesar's face was printed on a coin just in case you didn't get the message. But this, of course, would be a conflict if you were a Jew or a Christian during this time, because how many gods are you supposed to worship? 2?
1.
Oh, you are so smart. Yeah, and a wig, which I appreciate. Yeah, 1. So they can't worship Caesar and God. They can just do 1. And so this puts them at a point of contention with the government, and they're already oppressed. They're a minority. They're not people with a lot of political power. One of the other parts of this story that goes back to Acts chapter 2 is where it talks about how the early church distributed all their goods to each other and shared all things in common. I don't know, you might read that and be like, socialism, forget it. But what they were doing in this story, it was actually not only a way to meet everyone's needs, but it was an act of political rebellion. Because in the Roman Empire, there were people who were super rich and people who were super poor, and not a lot of people in the middle. So the early church was really interesting. And then we come to this story of Cornelius and Peter. As we heard in the scripture, Cornelius was a Roman soldier. And I think it's hard for us as Americans to imagine what it would be like to be occupied by another power. That's never happened to us. We've never had a foreign country come in and take us over. So it might be a little hard to imagine how awful that might be. So Cornelius, who was a Roman soldier, but also, as we heard in Scripture, was a God-fearer who prayed all the time, who gave money to the poor. He was still a Roman soldier. And so he has this vision, and an angel shows up. And have you noticed that pretty much anywhere angels show up in the Bible, people kind of freak out? Angels might be scared, because usually they have to say, do not be afraid. I've never seen one. If you happen to see one, just email Pastor Kendal. Just let him know. So Cornelius sees this angel, and this angel says, go and find this person named Peter. He's staying with a friend in a house by the sea. And I don't know about all of you, but that's my personal view of heaven, that we all have cottages by the ocean. I used to live in California, and they're pretty pricey right now. So that's one of the things I look forward to. So Cornelius sends some of his men who serve under him and some slaves to go find Peter. They come to Peter's house. But before they get there, what happened to Peter? He got hungry, Food is being prepared for him. And Peter has a vision too. And he sees food drop from the sky. I've always wondered about this because it says that Peter falls into a trance. Does anybody here ever get a little hangry? You know what I mean? It's like you get so hungry, you're just like past hungry and you go into hangry. Yeah, I think that's what happened to Peter. His blood sugar dropped. The trance might have been a little bit of a coma. We don't know. So they show up at Peter's door. And can you imagine what it would be like if your country was occupied by a foreign power and those soldiers show up at the door and say they're looking for you? I might be a little scared. And from what we know, Peter didn't even eat anything yet. Because when the animals came down from the sky, and God says, Peter, get up, kill your own food. That would have thrown me off right there. It's like I couldn't have done it. But he says, get up, kill, and eat. And what does Peter say? Peter says, Lord, I can't do that. You know that I've never eaten anything profane. Because as we know in Jewish law, it was very strict about what foods people were able to eat. And that was put in place because of health necessities at the time. So I can imagine Peter's hungry, he's confused. What do you mean? You know I've never eaten anything wrong, anything I shouldn't. And God says, what I have made clean, you cannot call unclean. That word profane that we heard can also be translated as unclean. What I have made clean, you cannot call unclean. Now, if it was me at that point, before anything else happened, I'd be like, hold on, I really gotta do something real quick. But the Roman soldiers come. They show up at the door. Peter goes to the door, and they tell him about Cornelius. And they say, look, Cornelius, he's a good guy, okay? He prays a lot, he gives away money, and he's had a vision, and he wants to see you. And so it tells us that Peter goes without hesitation. And good for Peter, because if we remember back earlier in the Gospels, Peter failed sometimes. Like when he went out on the water, does anybody remember what happened in that story? He wasn't skiing. What happened to him? He sunk, right? So it's like he tried and then boom, didn't make it. And then when they had the Last Supper, Peter says, Lord, I will never deny you. Never, ever, ever. But then when Jesus is crucified, what happens? Denies him 3 times. I don't know that man. I don't know him. I don't know him. So Peter tries and fails. So Peter is a lot like us, right? We try to follow Jesus and we fail. And then we follow Jesus and we fail. And we get up and we do it again. So that's Peter. And Peter goes to see this Roman soldier Cornelius. Maybe he's quaking inside. Maybe he's still so hungry he's like in this low blood sugar trance, so it doesn't matter. Either way, he gets there. And then he says, okay, why did you want to see me? Can you imagine going to the home of an oppressor and not knowing exactly what they were calling you in for? I give Peter a lot of kudos for that. And then Cornelius says, so I had a vision, and then Peter might have said like, oh my gosh, me too. We can both have visions. And then Cornelius says, I've gathered some friends and some relatives, maybe some cousins, all here. And then Peter says, well, this is really strange, because we all know that Jews and Gentiles are not supposed to eat together. They're not even supposed to talk or hang out or watch Netflix or anything. They're not supposed to mix. They're not supposed to be together. They're supposed to stay separate. And yet, God has called Peter, a Jew, to go meet with Cornelius, a Gentile. What an amazing story. And then Peter says to Cornelius, and even though we know Jews and Gentiles are not supposed to be together, God has shown me that what God has called clean, I can no longer call unclean. It's a nice story, isn't it? Until we start to think about, who do we call clean and unclean? What boxes do we put people in? People who agree with me all the time, clean. People whose views I don't like, maybe unclean. Maybe it's people who are poor that I think just need to get a job, unclean. People who like my sermons, clean. So we all have different boxes. Maybe somebody of a different religion, unclean. Maybe somebody who hurt us really bad, unclean. Maybe somebody who comes to our church, clean. Maybe somebody who goes to St. Andrews, maybe unclean. That'll just stay in this room, okay? Because people, right? I have lunch with them every Tuesday. So we all have those boxes. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, we do it all the time. Maybe somebody's sexual orientation, maybe clean or unclean, I don't know. Maybe somebody's gender identity, clean or unclean. Maybe you think it's weird to have a female pastor. Whichever bin you want to put that in. Again, I think you can talk to Lainey about that.
I'm back here now.
Okay, there you go. Oh yeah, good. She moved back. Yeah. So we all have these things that we do. And we know from the story with Peter and Cornelius, we can't do that anymore. We can't separate things into clean and unclean because of what God has done and what Jesus did for us. We just had Easter like 2 weeks ago. So we're all pretty aware and in the spirit of that, of the death and resurrection that gives us life and power. Does anybody remember the guy named Mr. Rogers? Yeah? We all do? Does anybody know that he's actually, or was a Presbyterian minister? Yeah, so he's on our team. Clean. So Mr. Rogers was actually a political activist. I know, right? When I heard that, I'm like, what? Because he had puppets and stuff. But one of the things that he did was when there was a big issue about people of color swimming with Caucasian people, that shouldn't be done, and people were trying to prevent it, because, you know, it makes so much sense. No, it doesn't make sense at all. I've never understood that. Mr. Rogers invents a new character, and the character is Mr. Mailman. And Mr. Mailman is a person of color. And so Mr. Mailman comes by to deliver the mail like mailmen do. And Mr. Rogers has a little kiddie pool sitting out, and it's hot outside. So Mr. Rogers takes off his shoes and his socks, and he puts his feet in the pool to cool off. And then he invites Mr. Mailman to take off his shoes and socks and join him in the pool. Pretty powerful stuff, right? An example of what we try to call unclean. Mr. Rogers shows us what God has called clean. We're all clean. And maybe you are someone that other people have called unclean. Maybe a pastor has called you unclean. And if that has happened to you, I am very sorry, because God has made us all clean. God has made us all. Please pray with me. Holy One, who hears our cries, we thank you that you have made everyone clean. We ask that you help us to no longer divide things into clean and unclean, and that your Spirit will take hold of our hearts when that happens and remind us of the story of Cornelius and Peter. Amen.